Welcome to week 2 for Clark College Humanities. This week I want to talk about water, an element human beings need to survive. A smart person once told me when discussing the high cost of oil, quote, "You know, we can live without oil, but we cannot survive as a species without water," end quote. The bottom line is that water is necessary for humanity to survive. The early people of ancient Mesopotamia knew this as well. The practices of water management by the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and people of the Levant transitioned humanity from a hunting and gathering society to a sedentary one that allowed for human beings to begin creating the early elements of what we understand as Western civilization. Before human beings developed institutions like temples for religious purposes, literature and educational systems, laws and governments, they first had to figure out how to grow and store enough food to sustain a population. Water was a very important element. Today, I and most of you simply have to turn on the tap to get our water or walk over to the fridge to get out products for our dinner. It wasn't that easy 7,000 years ago. Mesopotamians, the people who settled in present-day Iran and Iraq, needed to harness the power of water to grow food for the people and to figure out how to keep it from spoiling. The Mesopotamians developed irrigation systems, canals, and levees over the course of time to keep their agricultural system functioning. It continued to thrive until about 2037 before the Common Era, when the crops began to fail due to the slight amount of salt in the Tigris and Euphrates river water. The first environmental disaster hit the region, and no human invention, crop rotation, crop changes, weed fallowing, helped the situation. In fact, to this day, approximately 60% of the land is still uncultivable. The Egyptians relied on a more organic way of harnessing the power of their lifeblood, the Nile River. The Egyptians were not dependent on canals and irrigation systems like the Mesopotamians. Rather, they relied on the cyclical flooding cycle of the Nile. An ancient historian called Herodotus wrote that the Egyptians, and I quote, merely waited for the river of its own accord to flood the fields. Then, when the water has receded, each farmer sows his plot, turns the pigs into it to tread in the seed, and sit back and wait for the harvest. Sounds a lot easier than what they were doing in Mesopotamia. The other people that I want to highlight are the people who lived in the Levant, present-day Israel, Palestine, and Syria, or the land of milk and honey, a term that was coined in the King James Bible. The Levant consisted of mountainous highlands intersecting with valleys and canyons, producing natural sources of fresh water. Their water sources were not a grand river like the Columbia or Danube or Tigris or the Nile, but cisterns and reservoirs. All of these early civilizations' management of their water and natural resources led to social stratification and bureaucracies. The hunting and gathering societies were much more egalitarian than these new societies that developed in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant. Land, water, and natural resource possession meant power, and power meant the development of an elite versus work social system that remains with us today. Keep in mind the idea of the 99% versus the 1%. We also see the emergence of religious traditions and literature being tied to the power of water. Most early civilizations created literature related to flood stories. In fact, the Epic of Gilgamesh, a poem out of Mesopotamia, probably influenced the story told in the Old Testament of the Bible called Noah's Ark. The Mayan civilizations also had a story that they had created about the same time related to flooding. The last point I want to make this week is related to the idea that recording resources in writing and writing down the sacred literature of a society become very important. Recording resources because the people who gained the power needed a system to tax people to support their bureaucracies and government. The temple literature also became an important component of human beings and their understanding of their relationship with the natural world. You can't have these recordings, these poems, and the taxes being recorded, what one person has over the other, without a system of writing. Today we can store thousands of documents on a small computer like the Mac Air I'm holding. However, 7,000 years ago, the early people of Western civilization wrote on clay tablets. Their writing system, cuneiform, was a wedge-shaped one and allowed for the scribes of the kings to keep track of administrative practices. Can you imagine carting around a rock or a clay tablet as a receipt after you purchase something? It's crazy. You will note that the Egyptians figured out a way to make something more close to paper. Papyrus plants that grew alongside the Nile River were used to create paper. These early civilizations laid the foundations for us. Each civilization provided a layer for the future. Without proper water management techniques, many of which we still use today, we wouldn't have the sedentary population that we have who needs houses, bureaucracies, education systems, religious structures, like temples, writing systems, laws, language development, and much more. I want to close today by encouraging you all to look at the NPR podcast as well as the facts I supplied to you about the water contamination and water shortages around the globe. Remember that water stewardship was a problem 7,000 years ago and it's relevant today. Cheers.